When I was a senior in high school, I had a friend named Scott. Most of the details of this story came from him. Scott was in the gifted classes for college preparation: English, science, and all the tough math classes. One of his teachers was Mr. Michaels, who taught chemistry for the smartest kids in the school. Mr. Michaels was in his mid-40s, 5'10", and at least a little overweight. He wasn't mean or anything, but he wasn't the most charismatic teacher either. To be honest, he was really quite boring. Monotone voice, blank look on his face. There never was much of a lesson plan. He would just assign a chapter from the textbook, then sit at his desk doing who knows what, reading the newspaper or something. He really seemed to have lost his joy for teaching, that is, assuming he ever had it to begin with. Because of this, the students in his class would take advantage of the situation to talk and screw around. You may think that the smartest kids in the school would want to spend their time a little more wisely, but you'd be wrong. These students were just as willing to take advantage of the situation like everyone else. There were paper airplanes flying around, lots of talking, and just general disrespect for Mr. Michaels and his authority. Worst of these was Aiden. He was the typical class clown, and really used this class as a way to get some laughs. Aiden was really smart, and actually a pretty nice guy, but he was 16, and at the time he was more than happy to take advantage of the lack of supervision. It really is the teacher's responsibility to manage the class, so I think there's enough blame to go around. Scott and his classmates got used to it, and came to count on this class as a break to let off some steam. They used to call it recess, a time for games and socializing, just like the old days in elementary school. One day, however, things got out of control. Nobody knew why at the time, but one day, Mr. Michaels had changed. His bored facial expression was replaced by an angry scowl. His normally pink face had turned a deep red. His eyes were red and bloodshot. He stood up at the front of the classroom and mumbled,
"Read chapter 7, and do problems 1 to 9.
Then he walked back to his desk and sat down. The class barely noticed and went back to whatever they were doing, none of which was chemistry work. Everyone was talking and telling jokes in full voice. This continued for a while until suddenly Mr. Michaels grumbled,
Quiet down. Get back to work."
A brief moment of silence followed. I think they were just surprised that he was actually trying to assert some authority in the class. Just then, Aiden stood up and made an impression of Mr. Michaels. He stuck his backpack under his shirt to mimic the teacher's body type and stood there, mocking him. "Quiet down, everyone," Aiden said mockingly, waving his arm and laughing. Mr. Michaels walked over to Aiden, the class erupting in laughter.
"Aiden, sit down,"
he said under his breath. Aiden stood there laughing and making silly faces that were meant to lampoon Mr. Michaels. Anger built on the teacher's face as his student pranced around, disrespecting him. Mr. Michaels pulled his arm back and punched Aiden right in the nose. Aiden dropped to the floor, likely more shocked than hurt. Mr. Michaels stood there, his whole body shaking, tears running down his face. The entire class sat there in disbelief. Aiden sat up for a brief moment, then collapsed back to the floor. It was probably better to stay down. Needless to say, Mr. Michaels was not at school the next day, or the next week. Rumors started floating around in the aftermath of what happened. I can't be sure if it's true, but the dominant explanation was that the morning of the attack, Mr. Michaels' wife had left him and taken their children with her. He was left alone in an empty house. With nothing else to do, he decided to go to work like normal. That stress, combined with his unruly class, caused him to break. You never really know what other people are dealing with below the surface, and although it doesn't excuse what he did, it is important to treat people with respect. You never know who just lost their job, got evicted, or even lost a loved one. Everyone has their tipping point, and on that day, Mr. Michaels reached his. We never saw or heard from him again, but I hope he's gotten the help he needed. Back when I was in elementary school, we had a year-end field trip that took place sometime in the last month of every year. It was a way to celebrate and reward the students for all the hard work we put in to get there. We always looked forward to this time of the year, and it became a fun game to speculate on what the trip might be. It was different every year, but on this particular occasion, there were two options. One was a musical theater production of The Lion King, based on the popular movie that had come out around that time. The other was to visit the Six Flags Great America amusement park that was about a 2-hour drive from the school. I think you can guess what a group of 8th graders wanted. However, it was the teacher's choice to make, and they decided that we would go to the theater. This meant that we would be going to downtown Chicago, which is where the theater was. They chartered a bus, and in the morning, we set off for the roughly 2-hour drive. Although I was disappointed that I wasn't going to spend the day riding roller coasters, it was still an exciting thing to be headed to the big city with all my friends at the end of the school year. The suburban setting that I was used to made way for tall skyscrapers and large crowds of people. I had been to the city a few times with my parents, and I was always dazzled by the size of it all. We got to the theater and watched the show. Although I was a little pessimistic going in, I will have to admit that the show was incredible. I'm a big fan of musical theater to this day, and I believe that this show was a big part of the reason for that. Once it was over, my class began to make our way out of the theater. There were about 20 kids for each teacher, so you can imagine how difficult it was to keep everything organized, especially in a place that's so busy. I tried to keep eye contact with my teacher, but it wasn't long before I was completely lost. Like I said, this was 8th grade and I was probably about 5 feet tall, so I had no chance in that crowd. When I made my way to the street, I was expecting to see my teacher and class waiting for me, but that didn't happen. There was nobody there that I recognized. I waited for several minutes, looking like a lost puppy, tears streaming down my face. I figured that they had left without me. After a few more minutes, I was approached by an older man, probably at least 55 or 60.
Hi there. I'm a friend of your mom's. She told me to come and get you,
he said. How did my mom know I was lost? I thought. It was very confusing. However, I was feeling very desperate at the time, so I agreed to go with the man. We walked to his car, which was actually a white van with blacked out windows.
Get in the back. I'll take you to your mom,
he told me. I was feeling very uneasy and beginning to regret my decision to trust the man. I was too scared to say anything, though. I didn't want to make him mad. I stood there for probably 30 seconds, not sure what to do.
Come on, kid. She's waiting,
he added. I turned around and looked back. That's when I saw my teacher running towards us, a look of terror on her face. When I turned back to the van, it was gone. The man drove off. It turned out my teacher and classmates had just come out of the theater. I had somehow gotten ahead of them all, and my teacher was taking her time to make sure everyone made it. I don't even want to think about what that man's intentions were. This was the most terrifying experience of my life, and although it turned out all right, it shook me to the core. My parents did teach me all the usual things about dealing with strangers, but talking about it is a whole different thing than doing it in real life. When I was in high school, we had a janitor that gave me the creeps. His name was Mr. Langley, and he was thin, taller than average, with long gray hair. His uniform was ripped and tattered, and I'm pretty sure he never washed it. His smell was something I didn't recognize at the time, but now that I'm older, I know that he smelled like liquor. I wouldn't say he was mean. He didn't show any signs of anger or a bad temper, just kept to himself. In a way, that's even more scary, like he was holding something in, something that could burst at any moment. That was the feeling I got anyway. My school was relatively small, only about 200 students. It was in a quiet neighborhood. There was a parking lot for the teachers and the other staff at the front, and a public park at the back. Me and my friends would sometimes go to the public park for recess, since we felt a little more freedom being off school property. This was technically not allowed, since we were supposed to be on the school grounds during the day. If a teacher saw us, they would usually make us come back. One day, however, Mr. Langley saw us back there. He peered at us through the chain link fence without saying a word. It's hard to explain, but the look he gave us really creeped us out. He stood there for 10 to 15 minutes, just staring at us. When we eventually came back from recess, I passed him in the hall. Again, he didn't say a word, just looked at me. It may not sound like much, but I assure you, it was unsettling. Another thing I will say about Mr. Langley is that he hated our principal, Mrs. Swiss. Mrs. Swiss was quite the opposite of Mr. Langley. She ran a real tight ship and was not afraid to criticize. She was about 50 years old. Her hair was done up in a professional-looking bun, and she wore a pressed suit with high-heel shoes. She was the type of person who loved to enforce rules and make people follow them. Her style could be described as mean, or even downright cruel. I'm sure she thought she was doing us a favor by having such high standards, but my friends and I didn't appreciate it. Most of the students were afraid of her. She would walk around the playground at recess as if she was looking for students who were doing something wrong. If she came to my group, everyone would walk on eggshells. She was no different to the other members of staff, including Mr. Langley. And to be fair to her, Mr. Langley gave her every reason to criticize. His unkempt appearance, the quality of his work, and I'm sure she noticed that he was a drinker. Needless to say, the two of them butted heads often. They would try to keep their altercations away from the students, but I would see them arguing from time to time. One day, however, things reached another level. I wasn't sure exactly what sparked this one, but my friends and I saw them in a full-on shouting match in the parking lot of the school. Crowds gathered to watch as they went back and forth, hurling insults. Mr. Langley's face turned beet red as his boss screamed in his face. Mrs. Swiss pointed her index finger in his face as she screamed things that I don't care to repeat. It was quite shocking to see two people who should be grown-ups behave in that way. We watched for several minutes until one of the teachers shooed us away. I thought that was the end of it, but unfortunately, I was wrong. As I approached the school the next morning, I was shocked to see that the place was surrounded by police cars. One of the teachers was standing on the street. I walked over to her, and she told me that the school was closed for the day and that I could go home. I was of course excited for the impromptu day off, but I couldn't help but feel worried. Later that night, I was watching the news with my parents, and when I heard the name of my school, we all paid close attention. As it turned out, Mr. Langley had brought a homemade explosive to the school and tried to hide it in one of the utility rooms. He was caught by one of the other janitors, who only worked a few days per week. Needless to say, we never saw Mr. Langley again. It was quite disturbing that Mr. Langley had that in him. I suppose all the warning signs were there, but it's much easier to see with the power of hindsight. I'm not sure how long he was planning this. The scariest thing is to think what would have happened if the other janitor was not there that day. Maybe the fight with Mrs. Swiss was the reason he did it when he did. Perhaps he would have been more calculating, if not for the argument the day before. For all I know, this may have saved many lives, mine included. Nobody can be sure, though. Back in 2013, I was in the 10th grade and there were two kids in my year, Lucas and Greg, and they just didn't fit in. I don't think they were being bullied or anything, not that I ever saw. We even made somewhat of an effort to include them in things in and outside of school, but they were just weird. I don't know how else to put it. One day we were in class, and I saw Lucas break open a black pen and try to paint his nails with it. It was a complete mess, of course. Ink all over his hands and his clothes. The teacher sent him to the principal's office for that one. Greg might have been even more strange. You could hardly get him to talk. In fact, I think we went a whole semester without hearing him say a single word. Somehow, the two of them managed to become best friends. In fact, I don't think either of them had any other friends. It was not uncommon for either or both of them to miss school. That's why I was not surprised when one day they were gone. However, as the days went on and they never came back, we became suspicious. Everyone was talking about it, and everyone had different theories. My friend Andrew said they were sent to a different school, designed for people with special needs. Another popular opinion was that the principal was simply tired of dealing with them, and so he expelled them. Knowing what I know now, I wish either of those was true. About a month after they disappeared, a report came out on the evening news. It turned out that Greg's parents went into his Facebook messages and read his conversations with Lucas. There was ample evidence that the two of them were planning some kind of attack on the school. We never found out exactly what they were planning. The report didn't go into a lot of detail. I think there were some privacy concerns since they were technically minors at the time. Lucas and Greg were sent to some kind of mental health facility. Since they were underage and they didn't carry through with it, legal charges were never filed. This incident was very disturbing to my classmates and I. It's scary to think that I spent years sitting next to these two people who had those thoughts in their minds. We give a lot of credit to Greg's parents for recognizing the warning signs and digging deeper. Who knows what would have happened otherwise?